Good evening, and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, it's a real joy to welcome you to Westminster Abbey this evening. My name is Jamie Hawkey. I'm the Abbey's Canon Theologian, but also have the privilege of chairing the Westminster Abbey Institute. The Institute was founded in 2013 to nurture and revitalize moral and spiritual values in public life and service. One of the ways in which the Abbey strives to be a good neighbor, to love and serve unconditionally those around us. This is in the great tradition of the Abbey offering sanctuary and respite to public servants of all faiths and none, spaces to reflect on the ethical and moral challenges of public life and leadership today. Our autumn season this year is particularly poignant, extremely timely, as we explore the ethical dimensions of remembering war, rethinking the tasks of peace. 80 years ago on VE Day, the Abbey's doors were flung open to welcome thousands of people to continuous services of thanksgiving for the end of the Second World War. Today, as we continue to face conflict around the world, the Institute invites its neighbours from around Parliament Square and wider public life to explore remembrance and to reflect on the current demanding tasks of peace. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, the opening event of this series, and I'm delighted that we have with us tonight three speakers who are deeply distinguished for their leadership in public life here in the UK and much further afield. Baroness Ashton, General Syndic Carter, and Lord Williams. And to facilitate their conversation this evening, we're thrilled to be joined by the renowned war correspondent, journalist, and broadcaster, Rageh Omaar. The size of this audience suggests that you're as excited to hear from them as I am, so please join me without further ado in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Great. Jamie, I was going to introduce all of the three panelists, but you've done that brilliantly, so I'm not going to do that again. I think we should just dive into it, because I think the most important thing is for you, all of you, who have turned up in such amazing numbers, to be able to pose your own questions and a debate. So should we just dive straight into it? Do I need to introduce anyone again? No, I think so. Okay, let's get the most interesting and overarching question out of the way, which is, what is an ethical peace? What does it look like? How is it negotiated? Is it ever negotiated? I'll start with you, Kathy, first of all, because you negotiated the Iran nuclear deal. You were the EU Foreign Affairs Committee chair, and you were in that room. What did it look like?
Well, I think, an ethical peace agreement is one where the victims are at the center of everything you do. In the Iran deal, the critical thing for us was to find a deal that Iran could sell as well as we could sell. Because often with peace, so-called peace agreements, you are looking for a way to stop conflict, a way to prevent conflict. But you do it from your own perspective, and you do it with your own needs and desires at the front of that. And when it comes to lasting, sorry, excuse my throat, it's the end of a cold, lasting and enduring peace, it needs to be something that everybody can sell and agree is going to work.
Rowan, do people enter the room where conflict is ended and peace has begun with a sense of ethical purpose? And if they don't, should they?
They should. And that won't be a surprising response, I think, from me, because I think one has to assume that any sustainable, any durable peace agreement is one that depends on people wanting peace rather than the alternative. And they may not quite know what that means, but rather paradoxically, I think a good peace agreement means a recognition that the other side is not going to disappear, and that therefore some kind of respect for both parties, some kind of attention to the long-term needs of both parties, some kind of creation of a stake for the loser as well as the winner, however that's imagined. That seems to me the basis of any peace you might call ethical.
Okay. Nick, you've fought people. I've been a journalist, and you've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, lots of different places. How do you sit across the table from people that were trying to kill you and you were fighting them?
I think it all starts really with having to have a proper understanding of the people that you're talking to. And I was always very struck in my number of tours I had in Afghanistan that our insight and understanding of the local political dynamics was really rather thin at the beginning. And I think that was a problem, because I think until we really understood the culture and in a sense almost acquired a degree in anthropology in order to understand the tribal dynamics and everything associated with it, I don't think we could have a proper conversation. And of
Did
course,
that come afterwards, though? Did you understand that afterwards, whilst you were in theatre and having to manage operations? You had to learn that afterwards. I did.
Well, I did 3 long tours there. So I think I learned by my mistakes on the first tour to make sure I went away and did my homework for the second tour. And in the second tour, the homework benefited, because rather than thinking that everybody was the enemy if they carried a weapon, one recognized that actually this was much more about connecting people to governance. And it was therefore much more about talking to people about how they would achieve stability and actually how they would achieve trust in those who are providing their security and their stability.
It's also about knowing that they look at you differently to the way you look at yourself. So one of the things I do with young diplomats is say, when you look at a picture and you see leaders in conversation, you have a view who you like, who you don't like, what you think is going on. If you show that picture to someone else, they will have a different view. So you need to begin by understanding what they're looking at, what they think you are, who they think you are. And if you can start from that premise of having at least the beginning of knowledge of what it is that they think they're seeing, you get a better conversation.
And that relates to what I think is a very key point in so many contexts. An awful lot of ethical decisions are about power, recognized or unrecognized, and the perception of where it lies. And so often in any number of settings, we don't know what power other people perceive us as having, how that works. We don't understand how their perceptions of power work. And we were talking informally before about the shape of the table for negotiation. And of course, the messages that are given about power and privilege in that context can be very, very significant. And if you get them wrong, you have that much more work to do. So a self-awareness about how your power is perceived, it's an aspect, isn't it, of what you were talking about.
Exactly right.
Doesn't peace just need to silence the guns? That's the starting point, surely. Before you can consider ethical questions.
Well, I think silencing guns is quite an ethical question in itself, because it means the priority is to stop people being killed. But that's ethics, all right. But even in the process of stopping, you need to ask, well, what's going to stop it tomorrow? Not just today. Of course you work for today. And then you say, what kind of thing makes it sustainable overnight? And again, back to what investment people have. Primary investment, we'd like not to be killed, please. And what Kath said about the role of the victim is clear there, but I think it morphs very immediately into that.
I well remember obliged to withdraw from Afghanistan. And a lot of people would ask me the question, so what went wrong? And I said, well, you have to go back to 2001. Because, of course, what happened in 2001 was that the Americans, supported by others, defeated the Taliban and obviously continued to hunt for bin Laden. And an assumption was made by Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the defense secretary in the US, that that was it. And the upshot of that was that at the Bonn conference in December of 2001, when Brahimi, who was the UN special representative, got people around the table, he was not allowed to have the Taliban around the table. And the upshot of that was that the agreement that the Afghans came to, encouraged by ourselves, was not an inclusive agreement. And of course, that then led to continuing fighting 3 or 4 years later. And that was the structure that we put in place. And of course, it was going to lead to the problems that we had in 2021.
That was the point of departure beyond which it was hard to come back from, right, Kathy?
Yeah, I think, you have to begin with the fact that when you make an agreement for peace, you're not going to be doing it with your friends. It's going to be with people that you probably wish were locked up in a prison somewhere or simply would disappear. And it's an inevitable part of the process that you have to find a way to build a level of conversation and trust that enables you to work through the realities of what you feel to a point where you can see a way to find an agreement that will last. You don't have to be friends with them. You don't have to want to be in their company, but you do have to behave from an ethical viewpoint with all of your own standards of how you want to see them behave being upfront. So, for example, in the Iran negotiations, I said to the Iranians, whatever I do, I will not lie to you. I won't tell you everything. I'm not going to reveal my hand immediately, but I won't lie. So if I say to you, I can't do that, I can't. And over time, you get to a place where that allows them to find ways to trust you in return.
And I think I'd want to supplement that a bit by simply saying part of that too, part of the dealing with people who aren't your friends, is the recognition which at base level is pragmatic, but when you dig a bit deeper is profoundly ethical, that to assure the safety of your enemy is part of assuring your own safety. Yeah. In other words, you will not flourish unless to some extent they flourish. They must understand that for them to flourish, you also must. And that's a very difficult place to get to. For me, it's one of the most profound ethical crises and challenges to understand that mutuality. But in some way, even pragmatically, it has to make sense. I'm not safe unless my neighbor is.
Nick, when was the first experience that you had where you faced someone who was your enemy and you crossed that bridge that Rowan was describing, that you saw them, that they wanted a peace, and that fighting couldn't continue?
I mean, I guess Northern Ireland, of course, would be a case in point. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, this week that a soldier is now on trial in Belfast for his potential involvement in Bloody Sunday. And that, of course, tells you that these things take a very long time to play out. And patience is going to be fundamental if you're going to get to an ethical outcome. But now I think for me, the best example I would give would have probably been trying to enforce the Dayton Agreement in the Balkans
Bosnia.
From 1995 onwards, when as a commanding officer of a Green Jacket battalion at the time, it became very obvious to me that if we were going to encourage the return to happen of the displaced people in our part of Bosnia, then the former entity armed forces, both Croat, less Serb, but certainly Bosniak, would need to be moved. And how one went about that as a battalion, in a way, sitting around the table with people who were fundamentally against what you were trying to achieve, was a very interesting exercise.
Does an ethical peace mean having to pay a price for humanitarian... People need to be moved, as you said. I mean, peace is always messy, right?
Yeah.
people need to move across borders, they need to move, lose their homes. Does that involve an ethical piece?
Well,
It has to.
You have to recognize that wars end with ragged edges, not straight lines, that people have lost huge amounts already, that for some there will have to be a change, that they will have to move, that there will be people who have to make difficult decisions. Yeah. But in the end, what you're trying to sell, if you have an agreement, is something that is worth more. And if I give a quick example, I brought the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo together. 2 men, same age, lived a few miles apart, never met. And they came into my office, they were shaking, they were sweating, because for them it was like meeting the devil. It was either the oppressor Serb leader, or it was the upstart Kosovo leader of the Kosovo Liberation Army who had been a thorn in the side of the Serbs for a long time. And in bringing them together, there were 2 things that mattered. The first was something that Rowan said about the importance of what you give to those leaders, that you say to them, you are safe in this space. Nothing you say will ever leave. You can be together, you can work this out, and you can do it off camera. And the second is that you say to them, where this takes you will not be here. In other words, you will have to change, things will have to change, people will have to change, but what you are doing is giving the next generation the opportunities to remember the past, to mourn the dead, to worry about the missing, but to build a new life. And that's got to be bigger than simply saying we stay here.
Peace with a jagged edge.
Peace with a jagged edge, and the cost of peace. I think that's a very important thing. Part of the narrative we sometimes like to tell ourselves is that peace is a neat line under which is a blank page. And it isn't neat. It involves trade-offs, it involves compromise, it involves nobody being completely happy.
Does that trouble you?
No, not at all. Because in that moment of nobody being completely happy, there can be a transforming element of, but actually, this is now making things possible in a way that my being completely happy wouldn't do. But, sorry.
No, go on.
Just to underline what Kath was saying, what I heard there was the need to have a more sophisticated, a more humane narrative about how this works, to be able to tell stories about peacemaking that bring into focus exactly that process of things moving. It's not just a matter of shuffling static pieces on a board, but a story that says, this is making something different possible. Give it some oxygen.
Nick, did you ever find it very difficult to convey these kind of messages upstairs to...
Well, I mean, I think they're difficult to convey if you're operating on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're sitting in the capital city of Kosovo in 1999, protecting small enclaves of Serbs from Albanian retribution, that is quite a difficult message to get across. But yes, I think it's always hard to get the messages upstairs sometimes because, of course, some of the military realities aren't necessarily what policymakers want to hear.
It's easier for the Americans, and I really am interested to hear your viewpoint, why the Americans, Stan, McChrystal, they can kick it upstairs. It seems much harder to tell political decision makers this isn't working here.
Well, I mean, I think there's always a slight problem with the military in that we do tend to be overly optimistic, and we also want to demonstrate that we're making progress. But no, I mean, I'm not sure I agree. I do think it is possible in our polity to be able to have difficult conversations. And I think if you don't have those difficult conversations, then you're irresponsible.
Do you had difficult conversations with...
Very difficult conversations, but never really with the military, because the military were the people who first and foremost were interested in the peace. That they would say before there was any question of engagement, and indeed I remember, in those very early days when President Putin decided to move into Ukraine and take Crimea way back in 2014, sitting with military advisors in Brussels, as I was then, and them trying to work out what this meant in terms of how you could push back, but also how you could begin even then to think about the ultimate peace that would need to be in place. So for me, the military have always been the first people to say, we will do this, but then it's over to you. It's over to you to sort out what happens next. And we're much more interested, in a sense, in that, because we can play our part, but it's then over to you.
But the other point I think, Rageh, that's worth making is that these sorts of stabilisation come counterinsurgency campaigns we get involved in, they're essentially political problems at every level.
Yeah.
And as a military officer, you need to understand that the solution on the ground will also be a political solution, not necessarily a military solution.
Right.
Two recollections from the beginnings of the Iraq War in the early 2000s, when I just begun as Archbishop of Canterbury, and we convened a round table at Lambeth Palace to discuss in not entirely abstract terms what was going to happen. I don't know if you were there, Nick. we had some people from the forces. What was fascinating was that it was the professional ethicist in that group who was the most saber-rattling, and the military around the table who were saying, yes, but we've got to be looking around this and forward and through it, and not treat this as a performative matter, but as a set of practical problems. Second recollection is when the Iraq action began, an invitation to me to write something for one of the broadsheets, having, I think, put my cards on the table about my unease, to put it mildly, over that particular action. And I thought, well, the only thing I can actually write about now, given that the decision's been made, is there somebody who is actually doing the heavy lifting about how we know this is over, how we know the job's done, and what's ahead? And that, to me, is a fundamental aspect of peacemaking, that in and through a military action, you are thinking, what will count as settling this? And is that stable? Is that sustainable?
Are there any non-negotiables when you consider a peace? If it is ethical peace, are there things that are non-negotiable?
Gosh, I think every situation is different.
It is, yeah. I know.
I mean, certainly from my own personal perspective, if we were looking to stabilise a particular part of Afghanistan, so much of it was actually about removing the causes for why people would fight, whether that was corruption or a lack of stability or a lack of opportunity or whatever else it might be. And, when you think about the rather inaptly named global war against terror, so much of that was actually about removing the causes of terrorism. And I think, the architects of the war against terror never quite realised that.
Kathy?
The
Non-negotiables?
non-negotiable is the status quo. I mean, you can't, that's gone. So you have to bring people into the room to understand that they have a job to do upon which the future of a lot of other people rely, and that you are expecting them to do their job properly. But where you are now is not where you can be. End of story. And that's got to be fundamental to any beginning of a negotiation. We're not staying here. This chaos ends now, we move on. And then it's about understanding that back to the victims really, that the people who always suffer the most are the innocent, often in villages and communities and towns where they just want to go about their lives. So the end product has to be for them, and that's also non-negotiable.
It seems to me when you have Dayton or the Iran nuclear talks, it all seems very distant from the people who've been affected. Peace negotiations seem, ethereal, up there, disconnected. That has to matter, doesn't it?
I'm from Wigan, I can't be ethereal.
It has to matter. It has to matter. And that means that the communication of the process is as important as the process itself in some way. You talked, Kathy, about selling something, giving something that can be sold on the ground, in the street. And that means that part of the ethical conduct of a military action that is leading towards peace, sorry, it's a rather complicated way of putting it, that part of that has to be, how is this communicated? How is it effectively sold? How is it owned, therefore? And who owns it? Not just an elite, but something more than that.
Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who's, I think, getting quite a reputation at the moment, did a very good interview with The Economist the other day, where he talked about how Finland's experience post the 1940s could perhaps be translated into where Ukraine sees things at the moment. And to Rowan's point, so much of it was about the narrative that the leadership in Finland in the 40s put on the table, which is we are going to turn our country into a wonderful country. And regardless of the fact we're going to lose 10% of our terrain, regardless of the fact that 400,000 people are going to have to move west, etc., and it looked like we were defeated. But the reality is that we will be the long-term winners. And I think that point about a narrative and how you sell that narrative to a population who are, inverted commas, the losers, is extraordinarily powerful.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problem in peace negotiations are getting women involved in it. Yeah. Not because the women don't want to be involved, but because it tends to be, in my experience, a group of men sitting around a table deciding the lives of women. Nothing much changes. And, you know, I remember very vividly being in Geneva for the first conversations about the war in Syria, when we had the Syrian government and we had the Syrian opposition, and a bunch of people from Hillary Clinton to Alex Stubb was there, actually, because he was Foreign Minister of Finland then, talking about it. And the people who were outside the door were the Syrian women who'd come together as a group and weren't actually in the meeting. Hillary and I represented them. We spoke for them from the words they gave us. But it's very, very often the case, and we're all really bad at this if we're negotiators, that we don't really find ways to engage with the people who are most affected and for whom the small details will matter, how their lives will be, what they'll be able to do, the feeling of security and safety for their children and their families. And that's a really big problem still in all of our negotiations.
Nick, the small details of meeting people who bear the brunt of, a peace, a war. Describe those moments to us. That.
Yes, I mean, I think you know, at the lowest possible level, that's where these things get implemented on the ground. And of course, there's a sort of rather hackneyed military expression that's been used over the last few years about the strategic corporal. And of course, the point is, if you get a disaster on the ground at a very low level, that can completely upset the whole broader political agenda. But I'll give you an example, and it plays in a sense to Kathy's point about women. And I remember a particularly hot afternoon sitting at a community council meeting in Sangin in northern Helmand with the then provincial governor of Helmand. And we had been sitting there, I should think, for a couple of hours while the gathered elders all whinged about all the things that weren't happening. And after about 2 hours, we got to a point where one elder put up his hand and he said, "And when, Governor, are we going to get a female doctor?" And the governor looked back at him very calmly and said, "When you allow your daughters to go to school." And the answer is that when he went back to his compound, he very well knew that the matriarch in his compound was going to grip him. And actually, we didn't realize, I think, as much as we should have done, how important the female influence on the Afghan Pashtun male was. And we began to do something about it after that.
If I could just pick up on exactly this theme, with a little bit of national interest here. The Welsh Women's Peace Petition of 1923-1924, which was a petition organised by the League of Nations in Wales to have the women of Wales present a petition to the Congress of the United States of America to join the League of Nations. This petition, within 9 months, had gained nearly 400,000 signatures within Wales from women over 18, which is, pushing a quarter of the population. Point is, though, although I take great national pride in this, the point I think relevant to what's just been said is that this petition said it's not enough to make general noises about how peace is nicer than war. We also have to have effective international control of what we would now call people trafficking and the drugs trade and the arms trade. We have to have effective, agreed international instruments. And it seems to me that that was one of the things which the specific experience and the specific concern of women, not just Wales, but more generally, bore into that document. And it was picked up by quite a number of proto-feminist organizations in the United States who took it forward in the years that followed. So I would say that that's a very significant element in this process.
One of the things I think has been interesting about this conversation so far is we haven't really talked about St. Augustine and just war theory and all
we
of
haven't.
that, because in a way that's such an important context
It is.
to this conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, when you see what's going on in the world today,
Yeah.
It does beg so many questions that people in this room, I'm sure, would want to dive into.
It also needs more than the sort of framework of a just war. It needs a rules-based system that people observe by in liberal democracies, and that's fraying. So before I open, the issue to sort of questions, which is, how do you all feel, having been at the helm of very, very important institutions that have observed a rules-based system, seeing that fraying at the edges? Because how can you have an ethical peace if the institutions that are supposed to enforce that or oversee it are being undermined from within?
So I want to talk about tankers and yachts. Tankers are big and heavy, they move slowly, they get full of barnacles and rust, but they keep moving. And they can keep moving without going to port for a long time. And they are the rules-based institutions that we all sign up to and commit to values and ideals, aspirations for the future. And they are the UN, they are NATO, they are the EU, they are those kinds of organizations. And then you have yachts. And yachts are the quick boats that move fast in the water, can't stay at sea long, but they can get from A to B. And they are the coalitions of the willing, the support groups, the people who may have nothing else in common but that one issue. And the challenge in our world now is we're not looking after the tankers. They need a new coat of paint, get the barnacles off, keep them moving. And we're relying more and more on the yachts. We need both, but we need to do something now to stabilize the tankers.
The coalition of the willing, of course, assumes that there are the willing. That is, that there really is, I suppose, an arc that bends towards justice, to use a famous phrase, and that people are committed to that and prepared to pay certain necessary prices for that. In a chronically and sometimes lethally short-termist culture, that can be quite hard to sell. And what we're seeing at the moment, I think, is a very general collapse of anything other than a short-termist and often theatrical approach to some of these things, so that idle flag-waving and posturing stands in for commitment to those more costly, more time-taking things.
Yes, I think the world order that we all grew up with is no more. We're transitioning to something which none of us know what it'll look like. And I think the fear, when you look around the world at the moment, is that might is right. It seems to be the philosophy that so many of the strong men who lead these countries now, invariably septuagenarians, which I think is interesting as well, seem to believe in. And that's a really frightening time to be alive.
Thank you very much indeed on that last word. Thank you all for coming in such large numbers. Thank you to Nick. Thank you to Rowan. Thank you to Kathy. And thank you to all of you, and also Jamie and the Westminster Institute, Westminster Abbey Institute. It's been a real privilege to host all of you. It's been really thought-provoking and enjoyable. So thank you all very much indeed.
Friends, this evening has been an exceptional conversation, one of extraordinary honesty and integrity and depth. And I really want to thank, on behalf of the Dean and Chapter, but on behalf of everybody here, Nick, Rowan and Kathy for their extraordinary contributions, and Rageh for chairing so beautifully with such insight. I also want to thank our Westminster Abbey Institute team who have put this event on this evening at the end of a very long and busy day, especially Rob Thompson, our Deputy Director for Public Events and Engagement, and to all the Institute team for their hard work in curating, organizing, enabling this evening's event. Thank you to you, the audience, for being with us. One of the insights I will take with me from this evening's discussion is the need for peacebuilding and conversation about peacebuilding to be a really public discipline. This needs to happen in the public square, and your contributions have been every bit as valuable as anything else tonight. You're all warmly invited to join us to continue the conversation over drinks in Poets' Corner this evening, where there are all sorts of unsuspecting bedfellows lying next to each other, and also where you'll be able to purchase publications related to previous Institute events. We hope to see you for our next event in this series, which is on Monday the 17th of November in the evening, when we are thrilled to welcome Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who will give this year's One People oration. The 17th of November, please mark that in your diaries. But for now, please join with me in thanking once again Rageh and Nick and Rowan and Kathy. Thank you so much.